proposal. Please welcome. The other debaters for this round are George from China, Phoebe from South Africa and Hong Kong, and Zainab from Pakistan. The rules are simple. Each speaker has 8 minutes. The first and last minute are protected from the points of information, etc., and also marked by 1 knot. The 8th minute is marked by 2 knots, and also the reply speech lasts for 4 minutes, and it is completely protected from any points of information, etc. I would like now to invite the first speaker for the side of the opposition.
In his speech at the Belt and Road Forum last year, Chinese President Xi Jinping argued that the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, constituted short-term pain in exchange for economic growth. But his rhetoric makes it clear that China merely views the BRI as a means to inflict short-term pain for long-term power. That is why we are so proud to propose a few things in this speech. First, I'll go over framing, then I'll provide our first 2 arguments. First, that the BRI has been exploiting recipient countries, and second, that the BRI forces countries to take on excessive amounts of debt that lead to worse economic outcomes. Our second speaker will provide our third argument. On framing, 3 points. First, the BRI looks like banks that are mainly the ones that are investing in the initiative through things like loans, not subsidies, which is crucial to note. Second, approximately 70 countries are involved in the BRI, but 8 countries in particular are at very high risk of debt default. These countries are Djibouti, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, the Maldives, Mongolia, Montenegro, Pakistan, and Tajikistan. Third, the type of investment that the BRI entails is mainly infrastructure investment. So this looks like building up Pakistan's Gwadar port and investing in oil and gas pipelines. What is our stance? We regret the BRI. Regret meaning that we stand against the way the BRI has been implemented since its origin in 2013 till now. Opposition needs to defend the actual BRI, not just a hypothetical or idealized version of the BRI that does not yet exist. Our first argument is that the BRI facilitates exploitation of recipient countries. China uses the BRI to exploit natural resources of recipient countries, and they have a structural motivation to do this. Why? It's because China's seeing massive population growth over the past few years, which has increased demand for resources like oil and minerals that they can't get within China, so they have to get it from other types of countries. This is the incentive for them to be as extractive as possible. Under the BRI, this empirically looks like having specific negotiations of loans that center around resource extraction. So China may allow countries to repay loans under the BRI with resource rights, for example. This happened in Myanmar, where Chinese companies got rights to gold mines to allow Myanmar to pay off some of their debt. Second, we think this resource extraction undermines the long-term stability of nations in 2 ways. First, China engages in environmentally damaging resource extraction. This looks like deforestation in Myanmar to increase the timber supply in China, or releasing pollutants into the water supply of Laos when Chinese companies mine for copper. We think these negative environmental harms outweigh economic benefits for the following reason. It's because environmental damage results in massive health concerns, things like lung disease from air pollution, that hurt people's livelihoods, completely separate from any economic benefits that they might accrue. Second, this resource theft under BRI undermines nations' ability to support themselves. When China has total control over the resources of these countries, these individual nations are unable to support domestic social programs, invest in regional development, or pursue macroeconomic policies, which only hurts them further. Our second argument is that the BRI has caused recipient countries to take on excessive debt as China has overlended, causing worse economic harms. Yes.
Oftentimes, these countries are unable to get foreign direct investments other than the BRI program in the first place. What is your alternative for these kind of poverty-stricken countries?
We're saying that accepting loans from China is worse than if they had never accepted those loans at all, because they're entrenched in debt, their property is seized, and they're unable to actually benefit from the economic growth you claim. Now, let's characterize what China's primary motivations under the BRI are. It's regional hegemony. BRI might be economic in nature, but it's a means to achieve political power, and this is crucial. China is focused on regional hegemony because they see themselves as an emerging superpower. The BRI helps them maintain this status because other countries now become more dependent on China as well. We think that loans from China as well have fewer standards to ensure quality lending practices. So things like loan caps that you would get from other institutions don't exist with Chinese loans, which means that they keep loaning out to heavily indebted countries, and countries accept them, which only hurts their own economic status. We think there are structural incentives for recipient countries to accept these loans from China, even when they know they can't pay them back. It's because leaders are short-term in thinking. We think they get the money from these loans, they start a project, hire some workers, and generally have the guise of being productive. In democratic states like Malaysia, for example, elected leaders often leave office by the time the loan is due. So they're not the ones that really feel the consequences of having to repay these debts. And in less democratic states like the Philippines, for example, leaders are under immense pressure to provide economic growth, lest the people start demanding political reforms instead. There are structural incentives for China to overlend as well. The problem in China is the fusion of the state and finances within the country. Chinese banks are state-owned, which is unique to other types of actors. So they're not just economic actors, they pursue China's political objectives as well. The reason this is important is because Chinese banks, when they're making these loans, are not economically rational. So they're giving out bad loans because they're prioritizing political power and regional power over things like economic benefits. That means that when opposition makes arguments about China not having an incentive to give bad loans, go away, because these banks are not going to be engaging in economically rational practices anyway. By lending to countries who are unable to pay these loans back, China increases the chances of seizing their collateral. Collateral meaning that when you take out a loan, the bank has to have some way of securing the amount that you've taken out. So when you go to a bank and take out a loan, your collateral might be your house. And if you can't pay back that debt, they take your house. With China, the stakes are so much higher because these aren't houses. They're taking ports, mining, infrastructure that they funded under BRI. So even if there's investment that's going in, these recipient countries don't own that investment. That only hurts their own economic growth. We think this allows China to expand its territory and land grabs within China, which only increases their political power. This leads to massive debt buildup in these countries. So it's like Tajikistan, where their debt is 56% of its GDP, and of that debt, 80% of it is to China. This allows China to have an immense amount of power over these kind of countries. Let's consider multiple worlds in which these countries try to either pay or don't pay back this debt. The first world is one in which countries repay the debt. When countries try to repay this debt, they have to cut money from social services like healthcare to pay it off. This often means increasing taxes on domestic citizens that take people's money away from feeding their families in countries that are already struggling economically. Note the distinction between acceptable borrowing and unacceptable borrowing. Acceptable borrowing would be small amounts of debt that countries would eventually be able to pay off because economic growth would stall. This does not happen under BRI. Instead, what happens is unacceptable borrowing, where the benefits to growth are too small to justify the massive debt. So that, and this only re-entrenches the cycle of debt that we tell you is so important. The second world is one in which the countries don't pay China back, which we think is much more likely. Ultimately, what happens is they lose their collateral. Because countries have already offered significant amounts of collateral when taking these loans in the first place, China can now seize this property if they don't pay up. And they have every incentive to make sure that countries go into debt. It gives China a military strategy because now they have bases in which to build military bases on, like we see in Djibouti. It gives them a trade advantage because ports allow for strategic places to ship goods to a wide variety of markets. And China can literally charge these recipient countries fees to use their own ports because now those ports aren't owned by the countries, they're owned by China. We saw this happen in Sri Lanka, where their port was seized because they were $8 billion in debt and were unable to pay it back. We think when countries like Sri Lanka no longer have control over their ports because they've been seized by China, they can no longer ensure that their goods are the ones being sold in the first place. It's more than a violation of sovereignty. It's forcing countries to give up the growth that opposition promises and incur substantially more harms on top of that. So proud to propose.
And also invite the second speaker, the first speaker of the position.
Listing vague harms of foreign investment and debt won't win them the debate. Government must explain why their comparative world is better. With that in mind, our stance is, any harms of BRI are not inherent to the project, and therefore is A, existence on both sides of the house, and B, can be mitigated only on our side through negotiations and accountability. The Belt and Road Initiative will uniquely improve the diplomatic and trade alliances of the global community. Team Opposition is proudly proposing to do. In today's debate, we will bring three arguments. Number one, why BRI is the only choice for many nations to reach sustainable development. Number two, why BRI brings a better alternative than any other existing narrative. And number three, in Yeju's speech, in BRI filling in the global vacuum in economic leadership. On to my first argument, all rebuttals will be integrated. There exists a clear economic black hole in the status quo. Nations that they protect are often not willing to invest in underdeveloped nations like Mozambique, Niger, Liberia, because of their lack of infrastructure and consumers. Even international organizations like the IMF or World Bank pull back or place strenuous requirements that require these nations that they never have the capital to qualify for. In the absence of China, these countries fall into a perpetual poverty cycle and siphon humanitarian aid without substantive development at all. Humanitarian aid has proven to be itself a failure in solving poverty. It is underfunded, it is terribly distributed, and makes no lasting impact in elevating people from the poverty cycle, other than being a temporary band-aid. Then, how does BRI change the situation? Three levels of analysis. Number one, China is often the only one that is willing to invest in these countries and attach less strings in the first place. Unlike pre-existing organizations like the World Bank, IMF, or US, or the EU, they actually invest money in countries that those governments throw away of. For example, in 2017 alone, China loaned more money than the World Bank for projects like the Tanzania-Zambia railway system that costed $2 billion to construct and maintain, with a full funding, interest-free loan to be paid back in 40 years. It is simply a much better economic choice for these countries when they're stricken away from economic development from pre-existing narratives. Number two, unlike humanitarian aid that is simply a sum of money that's given, BRI uniquely builds infrastructure like underwater overland transport and provides jobs for local workers in the process. This means literally keeping the lights on in countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, with civilians having no prior access to a functional energy infrastructure in order to have electricity in their days. I'm very happy they brought that Tajikistan has a very high debt rate. Simply because they have so low of a GDP, they are incapable of providing their citizens water, food, electricity, and basic life support. If BRI is literally keeping the lights on, they have to justify why these people living out of electricity, out of clean water is a good thing. This also means that simply local businesses thrive using the reduced transport costs and times. Similar to how Malaysia is building ports and Malaysia is building factories on the previously built UK railroads. This means more foreign direct investment enters these countries as businesses now have both the infrastructure to set themselves up and the consumers with purchasing power created by the job opportunities of BRI. This means an injected stimulus, increased demands, increased circulation of capital, open doors for sustainable growth. Number three, less economically developed nations that are effectively landlocked from trade get opportunities for trade. Hard infrastructure reduces transport costs. Soft infrastructure with partner countries allow for a broader range of goods to be traded with fewer regulatory hurdles. In clear energy alone, the Silk Road will create a market of $7.5 billion. Imagine how many large new markets will emerge in the future. This directly clashes against their first argument in the sense that this impact is maximized considering the dead markets of the Middle East and North Africa that are rich in underutilized resource that can now be effectively mobilized when BRI transforms them into an emerging market. In a world where President Trump pulls out of the TPP, brings his advisors to get out of the WTO, and initiates trade wars with Europe and China, it is perfectly rational for these countries, barred from international trade, to make this road of trade. Yes?
Countries never get the benefit of economic growth when they struggle to pay off debt, give up ports, and sacrifices the resources that would have brought them out of poverty in the first place.
We'll talk about this more in my second argument, but quick response. The funny thing is, their comparative is not no ports taken and better investments. Their world is oftentimes the US, the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, giving out debts, giving more loans that are higher in interest, and further on, forcing these countries to take harsher standards that will not be an economic standard. Prove to us why your US investments are a lot better in helping these countries to a better stance, because we clearly see not. Then let's move on to that second argument. The comparative that government has is like nations like the US, Germany investing money, or organizations that are dominated by those very countries like the World Bank or IMF. We explained why humanitarian aid they give to underdeveloped nations is intrinsically worse than BRI. Then how do they compare to BRI in more developed nations? We have mainly 3 levels of response. Number 1, debt. They claim that debt is an inherent harm of BRI, but it is not. Given the fact that these countries will need investment in any case if they want to develop in the first place, being in debt is much less of a burden to developed nations in BRI. Given the fact that these nations have no alternative but to get investments from some place, debt is a problem that both houses would inevitably share. The clear difference we have between Team USA and Team Korea are that number 1, BRI provides loans with lesser interest, longer payback times, as our previous examples have illustrated. Number 2, building infrastructure, which Western investments were never devoted into developing, unlike China, is oftentimes the most effective in paying debt back. A lot of BRI invested countries, out of the 71 countries, they can cherry pick examples to say debt is a big problem. Because many of these countries use these infrastructures to pay their debts back. They don't build that infrastructure. We have unique benefits. Number 2, China's investment in ineffective distribution and humanitarian aid. They claim that the notice that the Western humanitarian aid is never effective as well, not making their world comparatively better. However, BRI allows that we effectively spend this money as China A can use its own labor force when they believe that local forces are not trustworthy enough. But B, China is engaging in a deal with massive figures being involved. It has more the incentive and more the power as they are making a deal to see if their money is spent on these investments well enough. But more importantly, number 3, they claim China will use their economic leverage to pressure countries and gain military, political, economic advantages. Number 1, 3 levels of analysis. Number 1, overall, China is a rising power that wants to gain massive economic gains through BRI. This gives them every incentive to be a nice actor and not enforce their perspectives on other countries. The easiest way to ruin BRI is to literally be a bully and change the ways other nations work. Look at how many military confrontations with other countries China has gone through the last 40 years. It's called 0. But we see when other nations from the West constantly engage in foreign conflicts like Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, many more examples, we see why they're never engaged as much as their comparative. But number 2, Team USA's China is evil because China logic doesn't simply stand. Because what's rather impressive in BRI is, considering its massive scale, is that China is not being a bully. We show you why the counter-narrative on their side is a history book of examples of US interventions and attacks. That's just counting the US. The US has 30 named foreign bases and 800 installations in foreign countries. China has 1 in Djibouti. Considering the comparative we have, BRI is never going to be a huge swayback where we sinister plans enact and militarily control over the world. They need to explain to us why the US comparative is better. But third of all, they can't simply assume China has an Illuminati plan to pull all the strings and manipulate the world economy. Because even if China is, to some extent, gaining economical benefits, we've proven to you why a lot of these countries are already in the consensus of what they're doing. Western countries bring privatization of markets, letting these conglomerates from the Western world dominate the markets of these poor countries. We believe that it's much better to build infrastructure within these countries to let them economically develop. Their comparative is always worse, that's why we win this game. Thank you.
I would like to thank the first speaker of opposition and also provide the second speaker of opposition.
Basically, the extent of side opposition's engagement on our debt argument was that debt is inevitable on both sides of the house. The West is bad too, and China is going to be super nice and give all these countries really low interest rates, making sure that their economies can thrive. First of all, we'll demonstrate to you why debt and abusive lending practices are actually way less likely with multilateral investment, but this is also a debate about scale. No, debt may be inevitable to some degree on both sides of the house, but their side is one that advocates for $900 billion in loans to countries. And at the point where no, China is not giving out low interest rates and recently doubled its interest rates from 2.5 to 5%. We reject their characterization, their very assertive characterization, that China is an incredibly benevolent actor, and their failure to engage with our arguments about the structural incentives it has to exploit countries for resources for its own gain. Before I introduce our third substantive argument in today's round, I'd like to ask two questions. First, what sort of infrastructure does the BRI provide, and is it in fact beneficial? And second, to the extent that it is, does that justify the massive cost that it takes to get that infrastructure? But first, what sort of infrastructure is provided under the BRI? Their entire first argument was basically that the BRI is the only choice for investment in nations like Mozambique and Tanzania. Notably, neither of which are in the BRI, but that's a separate issue. We tell you that actually the reason often that countries are unwilling to lend to such countries is because they're unwilling to pay back debt, something we'll talk about in our second question. But the large majority of their analysis was about how BRI investment allows these countries to do things like, quote, keep the lights on, which ignores the realities of what BRI investment actually looks like. This was our first argument. We tell you that BRI investment is not things like schools and hospitals and making sure that small villages in Tanzania and Mozambique get electricity. It's fundamentally extractive. It is roads from a gold mine in Myanmar that China has gotten control over to a port from which that gold is going to be shipped back to China or somewhere else where it's going to sell it. This infrastructure is fundamentally extractive. And when the gold in that mine runs out, now you have a road to nowhere. That doesn't truly benefit all of the people in Mozambique or Tanzania or Myanmar, a country that is actually in the BRI. So their characterization of what this infrastructure actually looks like is just flawed. But we recognize that there are some advantages to the marginally increased connectivity that the BRI is going to create, which leads us into our second question. To the extent that there are some economic benefits of this infrastructure being created, does that justify the massive cost of that infrastructure? Now, their argument was essentially that the ADB and other Western institutions impose conditions on loans lent to these countries. First of all of these problems don't go away on their side of the house. Those countries are still making loans. But second, we tell you that the reason that they're imposing these conditions is to make sure that countries are able to pay back debt before they actually engage in loans. And furthermore, we tell you that no, the scale of debt on their side of the house is not inevitable. We tell you that it is $900 billion in loans that China is uniquely giving out. That does not exist on our side of the house. What did we tell you in our speech? That China does in fact have the unique incentive to generate debt for other countries. First, because they want to generate growth for themselves. But second, China absolutely does benefit from all of this debt. It allows them, as Shreyoshi told you, to do things like seize collateral, to seize things like ports in Sri Lanka that allow them to put militarily strategic ships there and literally charge the citizens of Sri Lanka for the use of their own ports. But second, it makes these countries much more economically desperate, which makes them more willing to do things like sell their resources for cheaper so that China can continue to be extractive. Let us be clear that when China develops infrastructure to extract resources in certain countries, the economic benefits of those resources do not go back to that country. They go back to China at the point where China literally owns the mine that is producing these resources. But finally, it also gives China things like leverage to keep worker standards low. We'll explain this more in our third argument as well. But second, let's just talk about what happens if these countries do in fact become hugely economically successful, as they seem to think on their side of the house. If they do become successful to the point where they can reach economic independence, then they're no longer reliant on China, and China no longer has the ability to say, increase their regional hegemony and things like that. China doesn't want nations to be economically independent. But even if you don't buy any of this very real analysis, you can't just ignore the facts. The facts that Laos has took out a $6.7 billion loan from China that is 50% of their GDP that they're struggling to pay back. The fact that Pakistan's $62 billion of debt, China owns 80% of. The fact that in Mongolia, 85% of their debt is owned by China. It's not enough for them to just simply assert that China doesn't have the incentives to take on all this debt, to impose all this debt, without engaging with literally the reality of the situation. Why does this debt outweigh any marginal benefits on their side of the house? First, it means that sometimes debt just frankly outpaces the level of growth. So if I say take out a loan for $100,000 and I'm paying back $20,000 in interest, even if I'm making $10,000 more a year, I am functionally poor. But second, debt is just independently bad, because as Shreyoshi tells you, if countries are working to pay all of this debt back, it means that they pull that money out of productive infrastructure. It means that they're not spending that money on healthcare. It also means that they do things like raise taxes on their citizens, who now aren't spending money to put food in their children's mouths, but are just paying their government so that their government can pay back China. But furthermore, if countries default on their loans, it means that individuals panic and pull resources out of the country because they're worried about its economic future. But also in the future, other countries are less likely to invest in these countries. This happened in Greece, where not only did their debt lead to massive austerity measures, but also means that nobody is putting money into Greece anymore, hindering their long-term economic growth. Go.
Assuming but not conceding that all the impacts that you say are as bad as that, why are countries consistently opting into BRI because they think it's the best outcome?
Shreyoshi told you this in her first speech as well. For the appearance that there is going to be short-term infrastructure development, short-termist politicians that want to win the next election are likely to allow this. Turning away investment is a really bad look politically. But also just countries are scared of China. It's really hard to turn them down when their military is much more massive than like the military of Laos. That brings us to our final argument in this round, that this increases humanitarian abuses. First, that it increases labor exploitation. China has the incentives and now the power to suppress labor standards. Chinese companies profit off of low labor standards in other countries because decreased wages, cooling labor conditions, and things save China money, and now they don't even have to impose those costs on their own citizens. Chinese citizens aren't harmed when Bangladeshi workers are injured, killed, or are working 13-hour days for next to nothing. And now they have the power to ensure that these standards remain low because countries that are reliant on their infrastructure, for which China becomes their primary trading partner, or for whom Chinese companies are operating in their borders, if China threatens to withdraw any of these things, that's a pretty powerful incentive for governments to keep labor standards low if it means that China is going to pull out. This is literally what happened in Vietnam, where China invested substantially, and Vietnam knew that if it improved labor conditions, it would lose all of those kinds of things, which is why labor conditions in Vietnam have been stagnant and low for over 2 decades. We don't think that marginal benefits to the rich people profiting off of factories and mines outweigh the real costs to laborers in these countries that are suffering under poor working conditions and the ramifications that debt imposes on their nations. We're very proud to propose today's round.
So I would like to thank the second speaker of opposition for their speech and also invite the second speaker of opposition to come forward.
Don't let government side get away by not telling us what exactly the comparative is. Because the absence of the Belt and Road Initiative isn't an egalitarian world where every country can be free from debt and every country has an equal say in politics. Rather, it's American hegemony over the world, and we think that for the past decades, the track record of that has been pretty bad. We would rather prefer a world in which a multipolar power system exists, a multipolar power dynamics exists. That's what we stand for on opposition. Two things in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to ask, how has the Belt and Road Initiative impacted individual countries that are part of the deal? Secondly, how has the BRI impacted the world and world politics? And then I'm going to go on to the third argument and talk about how BRI fills in the global political vacuum for economic leadership. So first, how has the Belt and Road Initiative impacted individual countries in the deal? The Prime Minister tells you that there are things like resource extraction, that there are things like excessive loans. Firstly, they haven't been very comparative here. This is exactly what the West has been doing for the past couple of decades. We don't think that just because China does it, it's something that is worse. But secondly, we would say that these are oftentimes countries that are in a cycle of poverty because they have no capital injection coming in. They are going with a world in which there's no capital in the world, there's no infrastructure for development, and therefore individuals can't use that infrastructure. We would say that yes, on our side there may be debt, but that debt does not accrue for long periods of time. But furthermore, we are the side that apparently keeps the lights on, allows people to use roads, allows people to use these industries, allows people to get jobs there. We think that that's more preferable when these countries are locked in a cycle of poverty. Second, furthermore, we would say that loans and capital injection are oftentimes a necessary step in terms of development. It will also happen in a world without the BRI. This debate is not about whether loans are bad, but whether having another actor that these countries can borrow money from is a good thing. We're going to prove that. Two different stakeholders here. Firstly, countries that have no other alternative, countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. These are countries that have been locked out of the international system. Why is that the case? Because oftentimes the IMF, the World Bank, and America doesn't care about these countries because they don't have as many resources, because they don't have as much as political capital, and therefore these countries have no incentive of investing in these countries. They are the side that is locking these countries out. We would say that we provide them better infrastructure. Then the Deputy Prime Minister basically said that roads are built for China's good. But no, even if China builds the roads and infrastructure for their own good, presumably China isn't building roads that only Chinese people can use. Other people can use these roads and infrastructure too, and we think that at the point at which that is helpful for local individuals, we think that's a good thing. We think that it oftentimes does provide electricity for individuals on the ground. We think that's a benefit. Secondly, on countries that do have other alternatives, we're talking about alternatives like IMF, the World Bank, we're talking about countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia. Firstly, we tell you that these other alternatives provide worse deals because China lends money with the cheapest interest rate, and they told you, oh no, their interest rate just doubled. But they are not being very comparative because if they were to lend money from other private firms in America, it would be much more expensive. On pure economic terms, less debts to pay back is a good thing. Secondly, China has less strings attached to their deal. As a result of the Washington consensus, deals with the IMF and World Bank oftentimes have strings attached, like fully opening up their market and giving profitable ventures to MNCs. This has been destructive in these particular nations because it oftentimes means that these nations have lost ownership over the development. The track record of the IMF shows that that their ventures haven't been very helpful with development. But secondly, the existence of other alternatives makes the Chinese more likely to offer concessions and negotiate with these states. These counter all of the harms like labor problems and environmental regulations that they brought up. When other Asian countries expressed concerns about China's initiative to have veto power over the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China conceded that they won't have veto power. This is opposed to a world in which on their side of the house, the IMF, the World Bank are dominated by the West, and the US oftentimes does have veto power. Also, the Chinese have made concessions in Pakistan regarding labor conditions of local workers, and concessions across Southeast Asia regarding environmental regulations. This is all happening because there is not just one lender in the world. China wants to play a big game in the world, but we think that there are also other big stakeholders who are still willing to lend that balances out the power that these individuals have.
Point.
Ultimately, we would say, second question in this debate, how has the BRI impacted the world? The comparative that the government is defending is not an egalitarian world where every country has an equal say. They are defending the US hegemony. Why is that such a bad point? We say we defend a multipolar world as opposed to a world where US was the only game in town. We think this is better on a comparative. Two reasons why. Firstly, China is a rising power. It has a powerful incentive not to misuse these economic and political powers. It's in the phase of trying to win friends, and that's why they are much willing to give these kinds of loans that are much more beneficial than loans that any other international organization has been willing to give these countries. They are oftentimes more willing to defend the very countries that have been bullied by Western powers. Secondly, we would say that providing a counterweight to US hegemony is necessary. In the end, yes, both US and China will be self-interested to some extent. If that is the case, we would prefer a world in which these countries compete with each other in order to gain support from other weaker countries, rather than a world where US can bully whomever they want. We cannot regret an alternative being set up to the United States. Yes?
Your case is basically a series of assertions. China's interest rates are low. China is going to be nice. Explain to me why adding another bad actor, even if you accept that the actors in the status quo are bad, is preferable just to not having that bad actor out there in the first place.
Because bad actors have to fight for these countries to support them, and we think that that's a better world, as opposed to a world in which one bad actor can bully every other country in the world. We've seen how that has been so harmful to the status quo. That's why we can't regret the Belt and Road Initiative. Third argument on how a BRI fills the global political vacuum for economic leadership. The first level analysis is that conventional global leaders are tied up in their respective political landscape. With the world as chaotic as it is, leaders of many developed countries are facing problems in their own backyard, and they don't have the political will or capital to step up as the world's economic leader. Large countries are now more unwilling to become globalists, and instead they want to use their political capital for their own use, own goods. The US has exited TCP, they've threatened to exit NAFTA, on and on and on. EU funding and subsidy is now premised on transatlanticism. This results in decreased funding towards underdeveloped nations. Without global leadership, no other nation will sacrifice finite resources for the development of these states where they have more to lose than gain. In this particular chaotic world, China can be an actor in the global economic leadership. Because the BRI is the only option in which China is willing to risk and invest onto countries, and because it enforces the common values that we all agree should exist, is necessary. Secondly, China is willing to be a non-interventionist global leader. President Xi Jinping has gone above and beyond to avoid rousing international mistrust. They've implemented measures such as transparent negotiations processes and continuous multilateral dialogue, all of which is not happening before 2013, where US and IMF was the only actor that could lend out to these countries. The fact that countries as diverse as Nepal, Georgia, Oman, or Romania, all of them have widely differing interest and value systems, have welcomed the BRI, is the testament to how China is not willing to be an interventionist country. China has also embraced many reforms, such as adopting environmental regulations and hiring local workers. We think that these are things that are going to change at the end of the day. Ultimately, Xi Jinping does respect other countries more than pro-others.
Okay, so I'd like to thank the second speaker of the position and also invite the third speaker of the position to come forward.
At best, the opposition case is a series of assertions that they call a coherent argument. We don't think that just because they give you a lot of assertions like, oh, China's lowering interest rates, so that means that loans will be able to be repaid. Assertions like, oh, China's not going to engage in foreign conflict, so that means they're not a bully. We don't think that those arguments actually fall with nuanced analysis that we brought to you on our side of the house. They fail to engage with our comparative. They fail to engage with the structural incentive that we brought to you that explains specifically why China is more likely to exploit the countries it extracts resources from and why it's likely to drive those countries into debt. In this speech, a couple of things. First, I'll attack their third substantive argument and then analyze the three big clash points in the round. The first, what are China's incentives, just to clear that up? Second, how does the Belt and Road Initiative affect economic growth? And lastly, how does the Belt and Road Initiative affect society as a whole? Before I get into all of that, though, I want to analyze the biggest mischaracterization they made on their side of the house. They mischaracterized the comparative at its core. They simply say, well, the United States is the comparative. We think that at the point where Ella told you that there are other multilateral alternatives, it's not just the US or the IMF or the World Bank that exists, other institutions like the Asia Development Bank that China is a part of, other institutions like the ASEAN Investment Fund that China cooperates with, do exist. And if you buy their analysis at their highest ground, that China's only incentive is to grow these other countries' economies, then that means they are likely to structurally be willing to cooperate with these other multilateral institutions to, according to them, benefit these countries. We don't think that's necessarily going to happen, but even at their highest ground, we still win. Going into their third substantive argument, they basically tell you one big idea of how conflict is going to go down when all these countries are now economically interconnected. Few responses. First of all, we think that that assumes that China has no incentive to engage in other conflicts. We think that China actually uses the BRI for more nefarious reasons. And how do we see this play out? We think that China has a structural incentive, as they themselves point out, to grow their own economic power. But what does that power entail? It ensures that they prevent other countries from getting power. So, in order for China to protect their power, they necessarily try to pit other countries against each other, exacerbating conflict. We've seen it play out. Look to the examples of India and Pakistan, where under the Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has literally pitted Pakistan against India, causing India to fight Pakistan for more control over economic actions within South Asia that China is uniquely benefiting from. We don't think that the BRI decreases conflict. If anything, it exacerbates it. The first question you need to ask yourself in this round is, what are China's base incentives, specifically from the Belt and Road Initiative? Now, the big thing that we hear from the opposition is that, well, oh, China's not a bully, and they gave you two reasons for why this is the case. I'll address both of them. First, they tell you that, well, China is a rising power that wants economic gain, so they'll treat other countries well. Note the wording that they use to explain their argument. They're a rising power, so they want to maintain that power. At the point where we think that that goal to try and maintain power necessarily means they have to prevent other countries from gaining similar power, that means they're more likely to be exploitative. What was our comparable material? We told you that at the point where China is more likely to try and build up their regional hegemony, that'll mean that they are trying to use the BRI for their own ends. What does this look like? First, seizing collateral to boost their political control over other countries. Second, creating more roads that lead to China, again, to boost their regional hegemony. Third, creating other countries' dependence on China, again, to make them more reliant on China's economy. And fourth, countries become weak and distracted, and if anything, desperate for the investment that they say is so important, again, beholding them to China's interests. At the end of the day, China's regional hegemony supersedes all other marginal benefits economically that they bring, as I will elaborate under the second clash point. The second reason why they say, well, China's incentives are benevolent are that, well, they don't engage in foreign conflict. Seriously. That is the analysis that they gave to you in this speech. The fact that China's intervening in places like the South China Sea, feuding with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, even in South Korea trying to pressure them to not use THAAD missiles to ward off a North Korean nuclear attack, China is inherently aggressive in its foreign policy precisely because of the reasons that they give you, they want to maintain their power. Go.
The key difference is those kind of territorial lands are what China conceives to be it's their territory, unlike the Western countries that actively try to overtake other countries because they think that they want to expand themselves. That's the key difference. Why is it that China is worse under that comparative?
Okay, you literally just conceded that China is a bad actor and a bully. At that point, we shouldn't look to the BRI as a good actor, and if anything, we would regret its existence in preference for like a multilateral alternative. The second question you need to ask yourself is how does the BRI affect economic growth? This is where the debt argument and their arguments about economic growth come into clash. They say, well, investment is better because there's no strings attached. I'll get into why strings attached can actually be a good thing when evaluating the third clash point, but the second reason why they tell you why economic growth is better on their side of the house is because, well, China has lowered interest rates, and so that means that they're less likely to go into debt. First of all, factually untrue, China literally doubled its interest rates by the end of 2017 from 2.5 to 5%, meaning that even if you take their argument at the highest ground, that China has an incentive to decrease interest rates, they can't substitute analysis with reality because the reality is they raised their interest rates. This was the extent of their engagement to our debt increasing argument. At the point where they're increasing interest rates, it's incredibly likely that countries will go into debt. What did we tell you on our side of the house? Two things happen. First of all, in our first substantive argument, we told you that countries are more likely to be bled dry of their resources when China intervenes under the Belt and Road Initiative. What are the structural reasons why we told you this is the case, that they coincidentally did not engage with? We told you three reasons why China is more likely to be extractive. First of all, we told you that they have an ever-expanding population, so they just need more resources to account for their people's needs. That means they're going to extract more resources, like we saw with Turkmenistan, that like half of Turkmenistan's oil reserves are now controlled by China. It doesn't matter if you build a road if you can't trade anything or control anything that's traded on it. But second thing that we told you is that the collateral that's uniquely seized under the BRI directly benefits China. Why is this the case? Again, no engagement on the structural incentives as to why China will essentially seize things like collateral and drive these other countries into debt. We told you two mechanisms by which this happens. First, on behalf of the borrowers, and second, on the lenders. On behalf of the borrowers, we told you that borrowers are inherently short-termist thinking, and according to them, very desperate for infrastructure investment, which means they're very likely to acquiesce to China's demands, and even if that means driving their countries into debt. And then on behalf of the lender, we told you that banks are merely an extension of the Chinese government, meaning that even if it might not be the best economic decision for these banks to drive other countries into debt, they sure do accomplish their political motive of expanding China's regional hegemony. That means two things. Either one, these developing countries try to repay, meaning that essentially they have to sacrifice a lot of money they would have otherwise spent on things like healthcare, on like building up their hospital networks. We think that they now have to spend a lot of the money and taxpayer dollars that they collect to repay China, but even if they don't repay, we think that's infinitely worse because China then seizes things like collateral. The very ports, the very bridges, the very roads that are built on their side of the house now are owned by China, giving them greater power. But second of all, we think that it bleeds countries dry of resources, making it impossible for them to actually grow their economies in the future, since a lot of these countries are founding their economies off of their resource bases. Lastly, how does BRI affect society as a whole? This is where I want to point out that they had absolutely no engagement on our third substantive argument, where we talked to you about increasing labor exploitation. Why do we think, therefore, strings attached, as they say, are good? We think that at the point where China literally uses the BRI to bludgeon countries into submission, to threaten them by saying, if you don't keep labor standards low, we'll pull out our investment, that's an example of where no strings leads to China essentially gaining the ability to monopolize entire markets. We think that, if anything, you should support multilateral alternatives because they keep countries like China in check. That's why we benefit the most marginalized people who need economic development the most, while also checking China's growing power. That's why we propose.
like to thank the speaker of the position and also the speaker.
Let's take one step back before we go into the clashes, because it's important to know that the first and second speakers from proposition defended a world where they don't care about alternatives. Their entire case was on the idea that, look, BRA is bad. And after our first and second speakers continue to push on the comparative, but it's better than your societies. It's better because we have more options. Their third speaker finally comes up and talks about things like the Asian Development Bank. We're going to tell you, under their best case scenario from their website, that even if you buy every single point that they have, we're still going to take today's debate home. Firstly, is BRI a best alternative for these kind of countries in the first place? Assuming the best case scenario from the government whip about Asian Development Bank, we think firstly it's a principal concession, because they recognize that China is a power in which it is able to influence other countries in the first place. The Asian Development Bank is also one that is controlled by China. We think that their alternatives are not going to be any better in the first place. But secondly, let's talk about the scale of development in the first place. Because the Asian Development Bank is a total of $25 billion investment, but the BRI program that is held by China and the AIIB is a $1.3 trillion investment in the first place. The scale and impact that it can help these kind of developing countries is, we think, fundamentally different, and that's why we think the comparative stands on our side. Firstly, about the idea of countries with no alternative. Because we gave you examples like Tanzania, Zambia, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, where it was literally the first argument from our leader of opposition. The idea that these countries have no option to resort to, and they have to take this kind of policy in the first place. Because of the foreign policy that exists between Germany, between Brexit, and between the United States, these countries either have an option to continue to stay dirt poor, or use this kind of foreign direct investment to help develop their economies in the first place. Of course that's going to exist under our side of the house. But not only is it not going to exist under their side of the house as well, but they systematically deny the opportunities for these countries to become better. But secondly, under their better case scenario of countries with less viable opportunities, for instance, countries like Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Sri Lanka, we think firstly it is the government calculus of these states to decide whether the BRI program is better, or whether their alternatives are, for instance, the World Bank or their other alternatives is better. We think the fact that these countries have decided that, look, we have these different options, but we choose the BRI program, is in and of itself what these countries are going to best benefit from. We think it's very patronizing for them to just say that, look, they're incompetent making the decisions because the political referendum, or because these people have an incentive to take the easier way out. We don't think that's going to be the truth in the matter. Secondly, about the BRI's impact in a global society. Because we question why the Chinese implemented the BRI program in the first place. We think the biggest reason is because, as our first speaker and second speaker talked about from the very beginning of their speeches, is that China is a rising country, and it wants to become more influential and have a more multipolar society than the conventionally Western-dominated societies as a whole. Then why is this analysis so important? Because they don't seem to reject this point as a whole. Because we told you systematically that for China China should not abuse, and they don't abuse their powers, because the fact that thank you. The fact that China wants to expand its soft power means that it needs to show itself as a country that is not willing to abuse. You don't believe me? Let me give you examples. For instance, they have had a $5 million they forgave $5 million of debt to Tanzania. They gave $40 million to Zimbabwe and $60 million to Cambodia. These kind of things shows that China is not always a money-seeking entity that is wishing to extract funds off all these countries and try to dominate in the economic sphere. China also wants to look good, which is why, comparatively speaking, they are less likely to bully upon them from their side of the house. And then they give examples like foreign policy and how China is expanding to South China Sea. We think, first of all, okay, we did concede that China is not the best actor, they're not the most altruistic actor. But comparatively, these are states in which China believes that they rightfully own. It's a comparative to their side, where Western countries are actively attacking and invading other countries as a whole. And that's why we point to you towards things like conflicts. Because the last time China had a real full-out war and conflict was in 1979 between China and Vietnam. Ever since then, Xi Jinping has tried to continue to have his image better so that the international community would recognize and give China a better uphold than what is currently going on in the status quo. Yes?
You just said that China already sees itself as owning these other countries. The BRI just gives them the ability to do that.
There is a difference between China saying that they own the countries and China wishing to expand upon these countries in the first place. Because on their side, we keep giving the comparative that these Western countries, to impose their own political views, impose their own economical views, they're willing to invade other countries that they know it's not their own. Like, I'm pretty sure the United States knows that Iraq is not their own country, but China, comparatively, is only trying to take an advantage over countries that it thinks it's own in the first place. We think that the comparatively is lacking in the first place. But thirdly, and most importantly, is the idea of BRI's impacts on individual countries in the first place. 4 different responses and stakeholders that exist. Firstly is resource extraction. Because they give cherry-picking examples, like a road to a gold mine in a coastal city and taken away in the first place. We think, okay, in the worst case scenarios, China may be doing some of that in the first place, which is why we've already conceded that China is not the best actor in every single instance. But the idea that we upheld from side opposition was a multipolar society, a country in which even if we concede that China is the worst actor, that they still have to fight for these actions against the Western liberal democracies or the World Bank that exists within the status quo in the first place. The fact that we argue in their best case scenario that China is still having to fight for this means that developing countries would best benefit because they have more options to choose from now than previously where they only had to resort to one option, and now these options would be dominated by the Western-centric countries in the first place. So resource extraction, we think the Western countries have been doing this as well. We don't think comparatively it's any worse under our side of the house. Secondly, economic leverage. They seem to say that only China is the one doing economic leverage in the first place. Not only have we given you a systematic analysis to say why China is less likely, we think also that their side is doing so as well. We gave you the example of Washington Consensus, which had literally no engagements from the government side. The idea that the United States and these Western countries forced these developing countries to liberalize and privatize to expand the markets within these kind of institutions and within these kind of countries. These are economic leverages that other countries use as well for their own well-being in the first place. I question then why the alternative is so bad on our side of the house when both sides are doing it, but at least we gave you the systematic analysis that because China is a rising power, they're less incentivized to do this. But thirdly is about infrastructure, because they make a big deal that these countries are unable to pay debts, and that's why this will always be bad in the first place. Firstly, that's very looking at one side of the analysis, because there are countries that are able to pay their debts back. But secondly, the only option that they resort to is, for instance, the Sri Lankan port that has been stolen away by the Chinese people in the first place. But if we look at the other side of the news, it wasn't just the stealing away from the debt. China gave $584 million in reparation for also taking the port for 99 years. These kind of things shows that China is not just the actor that is willing to steal everything, but they are willing to negotiate as well. Sure, we wish to live in an ideal scenario where Sri Lanka was able to pay its debt. But as far as they're unable to, the comparative is that they have $584 million of investment, and they have a port in the future that they can build, a port that they can use in 99 years, but also right now, in the first place. But on their comparative, countries like Sri Lanka, Tajikistan have no opportunities to develop themselves. This isn't the perspective of the United States on whether the Chinese global hegemony is expanding. This is in the perspective of the developing countries, the rest of us, on whether we can best benefit from a multipolar society. We are more than proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to thank third speaker for their speech and also invite the reply speaker.
in order to assess this debate, one has to ask oneself the question, what would the world have looked like if it weren't for the Belt and Road Initiative? We don't think that the world is any better without the Belt and Road Initiative. We think that many countries would still have been in debt and still have been unable to pay their debt back. We think that many countries would still have been exploited, not by China, but other actors all around the world. We create a counterbalance and a counterweight to a world that has been already too dominated by Western powers and the United States for more than proud to oppose. Two things in this debate. Firstly, how has the BRI impacted countries in the deal? Secondly, how has the BRI impacted the world? So firstly, how has the BRI impacted countries in the deal? They give you two comparatives. Firstly, they give you the world without any deals, and they simply assert, oh, because you have no debt, then that's a better world. But we already told you that at the expense of debt, we make the lives of people in those countries better. Because we're oftentimes talking about economic black holes that are in a cycle of poverty in which no other entity is willing to invest, in which there's no infrastructure, and therefore no ground for development in the first place. We told you that people are getting jobs, electricity, roads to go to other places in these particular areas. Sure, it may come at the expense of debt, but we think that these are things that people are getting, and these are things that people would not have gotten under their side of the house. Ultimately, you lock these countries, the poorest of nations, into the most vulnerable situations. We are the side that does not say that you have to permanently remain in poverty. You don't get these things under your side of the house. But secondly, they talk about alternative deals for many other countries. Firstly, we told you that these deals aren't necessarily any better. Furthermore, we told you that oftentimes the multilateral organizations that they are talking about oftentimes coerce these nations to open up markets, and these are the ways in which they have already been exploited in the status quo. We would prefer a world in which China has to compete against these alternative deals for their own deals. We told you the incentive that China has to compete. We told you the examples in which China did make concessions because oftentimes it meant that they had to engage in competition. We gave you the example of Pakistan, in which they cut down, in which they had to modify their policies in order to accommodate for better labor regulations. We gave you the example of Southeast Asia, where they started imposing better environmental regulations when the country is back on the ground asked for it. These are things that you wouldn't be getting under their side of the house because it's only one particular entity or like a particular entities that are connected. And oftentimes the countries don't have any leverage over the policies that are imposed by these particular nations. All of this was unresponded to. They simply said, oh, China's bad, but that's very uncomparative. We would say that yes, China may not be the best actor in the world, but we would prefer more actors than less. Second question in this debate, how has BRI impacted the world? We gave you the comparative of a multipolar world on their opposition side versus US hegemony on Gulf side. They simply said that that's not the comparative, but if you look at what the world looked like before 2013, where the Belt and Road Initiative was when the Belt and Road Initiative started, any and every country was at the whim of the United States, whether it be political, whether it be economic. We would say that we haven't gotten rid of the harms completely, but we've mitigated that harms as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative. Because even if you're going to have 2 self-interested actors or 3 self-interested actors in the world, the fact that these countries have to fight for support and fight for deals from the weakest countries gives the weakest countries leverage. We've already told you why this leverage is particularly important and valuable. Ultimately, don't let them get away by saying that they are the side that stands for the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable individuals. These vulnerable countries are benefiting as a result of BRI. Surely they can't be the next global superpower, but they're having infrastructural development, they're having more leverage and gaining more leverage over countries that are too powerful. We're more than proud to oppose.
So I would like to thank the reply speaker for their speech and invite the last speaker of this debate to come forward.
It was pretty clear that side opposition was getting nervous towards the end of this round because more and more of their rhetoric started being, oh, well, even if China's really, really bad, then the West is worse. This comparative was really misguided because note that the West doesn't suddenly magically disappear on our side of the house, even though their third argument actually made that argument. But also, even if the West is bad, adding another really terrible actor to make damaging lending is not the way to solve that problem. They say that the West is bad and countries need an alternative. But if that alternative is worse or still bad, then we take this debate. 2 questions in this speech. First, which side benefits nations economically? And second, which side decreases conflict and exploitation and the other things we care about in this round? But first, let's talk about the economy. Now, their only argument here was just basically a repeated assertion that countries need more investment to thrive. We value investment, but we're telling you that the kind of investment that China provides makes the situation worse, and their failure to engage with this analysis is what loses them the round. We told you from our second speech and first speech that this infrastructure is fundamentally extractive. The only response that they had was, no it's not. China also builds electrical infrastructure with no analysis on why that's true or explanation of why China has the incentives to do so. We told you about all the incentives that China has to just build a road from, say, a mine to a port. That was not enough of a response. But we also told you on the comparative, even if some of these marginal benefits to infrastructure do accrue, we tell you that the way that China makes these loans is ridiculously damaging. And now their argument on this was basically an assertion that China is going to be benevolent and have low interest rates. This was an assertion and ignored the realities of what the BRI has already done. Ignored the reality that China has literally doubled its interest rates and has absolutely the incentives to increase debt for these countries. We told you about their incentives to do things like increase debt so much that countries default on their collateral and have to give up their ports to China, something that happened a couple of years ago. I don't know what this argument their third speaker was making, but a port that was owned for 99 years. It clearly wasn't what we were talking about. It also means that these countries are so desperate that they do in fact sell their mineral resources to China and allow China to literally exploit all the resources, taking away that wealth from that country. Now they made this argument in their third speech, oh, but China forgave $5 to $60 billion of some countries' debt. Let's not ignore the fact that most of the debt that countries owe to China is in the billions or tens of billions of dollars. $5 million is a cosmetic drop in the bucket. All of the nominal reforms that China has made that they bring up late in the debate are basically so that China looks like it's being benevolent, but in reality, countries still owe crippling amounts of debt to China. Why do we tell you that this is literally worse than no investment at all? First of all, that investment isn't particularly beneficial. Second of all, countries have to take money out of things like healthcare, and also, in the long term, other countries are very unlikely to actually invest in these other countries. Meaning, this is what happened in Greece, where massive austerity measures were improved, and the country's economy is literally in the toilet. We don't want to subject other countries to the same fate. On the economic point alone, we take this debate. But now let's move on to the second issue of which side decreases conflict and exploitation. Their argument here was, wow, a pattern, another assertion that China doesn't engage in conflict exacerbating sorts of policies. Even if you think that the West is bad, if we demonstrate that China also exacerbates these sort of things, we take this debate. This was our third argument about how China absolutely has interfered in countries' politics to keep labor standards low. They did this in Vietnam, where they used their economic leverage to depress working conditions. They suppressed labor union support in Cambodia. They also do things like invest in the Pakistan Economic Corridor and do things like force Pakistan to station 15,000 soldiers at the border, at conflict-ridden borders with India. The idea, the assertion that China is benevolent, that China doesn't increase conflict, is just flies in the face of reality. That is why we take this round.